The internet is cracked, the show that asks the question: can we coexist with our creation?
Hi, I'm Seth Camillo.
And I am Caroline Risberg, and we are The Internet is Cracked by Addicts for Addicts.
And today we are very lucky to have Dr. Joseph Bailey, and he is a professor at the Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland. He's also Associate Dean of Undergraduate Programs, and he's got his PhD from MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which is very, very impressive. So, we're going to talk about economics and the internet and robotics and AI and all that stuff. And we're going to figure it out, right?
Absolutely, Seth. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I think we're going to start out with a broad question and we can sort of narrow down, which is how has the internet fundamentally changed the way markets operate compared to the pre-digital era? And I specifically we are interested in how network effects
Mm,
have really, I mean, because that seemed like it was unforeseen.
I mean, network effects is really the strength of the internet. The idea that
mm,
the value of a network is a function of the number of participants, and so much of the growth of the internet, its impact on society, the way it has spillover effects into adjacent markets. A lot of it can be traced to network effects. So I think you're starting us off on the right foot by trying to talk about these kind of big and important questions, but starting with this fundamental driver that, again, the strength of a network is the size of the number of participants. And if we just start with kind of the very tenets of competition,
mm,
how does competition change when we think about the network effect? It changes the nature of the products that we buy and sell. It changes the way we think about the shapes of the supply and demand curves. It changes the way we think about the impact that one market has on an adjacent market. So while it might have been true kind of in a pre-digital stage to say, geographic boundaries matter tremendously with insulating people from competitive pressures, it's just not the case anymore because we can
mm,
see what's going on. For example, in European markets with things like fine wine, and recognize their, arbitrage opportunities if only there weren't these, pesky transaction costs. But now we can introduce, digital products and services. And, now when are releasing a really great wine, that it needs to play to a global marketplace. Anyway, it just, I'm always fascinated and intrigued by these developments, and I mean, it's been just, incredible to watch how it's transformed our society.
yeah, so what's the biggest economic growth out of internet-based business today? Do you think the internet has created more economic winners or losers, and why in that case?
Yeah, and it's a great question, and I think for anybody who's kind of addressed this over the years and have looked at it kind of simply as, is it a net positive or a net negative, kind of has developed a much more nuanced view of it. So we know there are some people who are winners and there are some people that are losers. The losers are typically the ones who have positioned themselves kind of based upon the more Luddite perspective of insulating yourself from this technological change and trying to prevent consumers from gleaning information. I think back to, travel agents, for example, that might have been
Mm,
trying to hold on as their market position as an intermediary, using kind of the fact that information is not fully well known. But then, of course, it gave rise to the fact that new forms of intermediaries come into that marketplace and, play a very incredible role in helping kind of create market efficiency. So there's always going to be winners and losers. I think, given the current climate today, is we're getting to the
mm,
point where we're looking at market concentration as potentially seeing a big shift in what would be kind of moving consumer surplus to producer surplus. And I'm a
mm,
business school professor, and in business we love it when producers aren't faced with the all of the problems of perfectly competitive markets. And we like there to be a little bit of friction or a little bit of market power. So that way you can go ahead and take advantage of your size in markets. And we
mm,
haven't gotten to the point of where there's complete, tipping point, such that we have, so much concentration that it has really eroded any type of consumer surplus. Consumers are benefiting much more now than ever, especially when you look at product proliferation, the way in which products themselves are combinations of physical and digital. But, we can't ignore the fact that the tech industry dominates the market cap tables of
Yeah.
global markets. And whether it's,
Mm.
because of network effects or because of the way in which kind of you get these incredible scale economies for companies, um, the producers really have become winners in this marketplace. And again, it's not that consumers have lost, but the ones who have kind of prevented these technological evolutions or changes are definitely the losers.
Mm.
Yeah. I find that to be very interesting that you know, you as a business professor want a little bit of network event effect. You want some reward for innovation, I guess, is what it comes down to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you think about it, I as a company want to be able to leverage kind of my market positions to explore new markets or to find new acquisitions in adjacent markets, so that the proverbial kind of synergies that exist, where you have these two entities that can exist and be combined. So when you look at, let's say, the companies like Apple and Meta
Mm.
and Google, Microsoft, like again, the ones that kind of are at the top of the cap table, they're the ones who have found these adjacent markets and exploration. And their argument is going to be through the network effects that we've generated with some of our core businesses. Even if we're not necessarily making monopoly profits in that, we know we're not trying to. We're leveraging those network effects to bring new products and services to market. Not everybody agrees with that. Certainly, the Europeans are a little bit grumpy when they take a look at the leadership position that a lot of these U.S. companies have, and so the U.S. companies have had to try to adjust. But of course, now the new war is less about, well, the U.S. and Europe. It's what's going on in China and artificial intelligence, and
Oh,
Yes.
we'll
yeah.
see, of course, who's going to come out on top. Again, I think the U.S. is in a pretty good position, but you can't ignore some of the strides that the Chinese tech companies have made in that space.
Well, that is interesting because Caroline and I were just talking about this, about network effects in AI.
Yeah.
Is there a network? I mean, because it seems as though what we're hearing is two things. One, the Chinese AI is stealing, and
Yeah.
that's why it's so cheap. Or people are actually innovating and maybe breaking down the financial barriers, and there may not be as much network effect for AI.
Yeah, and I think, when we think about network effects, again, the idea is the more people participate, the more valuable it is.
Mhm.
And I think we're seeing with AI models is the idea of a large language model is very much consistent with a network effect. You ingest more a volume of content, especially when it comes to natural language, and the value of these tools become much better. But there's kind of been a pendulum swing in AI where there's small language models are also kind of very prevalent, or where you have these kind of smaller corpus of knowledge that could be kind of unique to a corporation or an entity. And because you have this closed, entity of learning, not only can you keep it to yourself, but maybe there's value there. In other words, instead of, once you found the needles that are residing within a haystack, um, you don't want to go ahead and ingest more haystacks without any needles. So I keep it preserved in this
Wow.
smaller ecosystem. So I think the network effects are driving kind of a lot of the movement towards the large language model, but there can actually be this idea of preservation of a smaller ecosystem. The law of diminishing marginal returns kind of still holds up when it comes to some of these AI models. Again, for nuanced applications.
So with AI increasingly, I mean, what is saying, like, replacing human labor, what kind of economic shift do you foresee in the next decade?
We worry a little bit about humans being replaced by AI,
Yeah.
but in fact, it becomes this huge enabler for us to go ahead and kind of get away from some of the more routine and grunt work where AI can actually do it. And then humans are freed up to do the much more interesting stuff, right? So again,
Okay.
if you look at a lot of algorithms and you say, oh, well, 90% of that can be replaced by AI. Well, if that's true, that 90% is the least interesting part of someone's job, then they can focus on the 10% that makes it much more interesting.
Well, Sam Altman said two really interesting things, and I think they're kind of related. He said AI will allow the first $1 billion market cap company that has only one employee to
Oh,
exist.
yeah.
And he also he's expecting a child, and he says, "My child will never be smarter than AI." So I think these things juxtaposed, you know, where are we headed?
Mm,
Is this stuff hyperbole? Is it a bubble? Or do you really think this is going to be useful
right. Good.
40 years from now?
Um, so I mean, a couple of thoughts and reactions, right? So I think some of it is hyperbole. I think some of the people who are looking at again a one person company with $1 billion market capitalization is probably hyperbolic, but we definitely see much more economies of scale within firms, and so the fact that if you look at the ratio of market capitalization to number of employees, right, that ratio is really never been higher. We just don't need as many people to go ahead and run an organization. Even something like the bricks and mortar of office space and buildings, right? That can
Mhm.
all go away. So that's definitely true. Maybe $1 billion for every employee, a little hyperbolic, but pretty compelling, right? And worth a discussion.
Mhm.
With regard to how AI can become potentially smarter than a human,
Mm,
it is true that again for the routine stuff, but can an AI tool grow and learn at look at the exceptions, be able to manage the nuance and the kind of emotions that come into decision making, and I think that's where again it's worthy of a discussion. I'm not as I don't know. It's not necessarily optimism, but I'm not as bullish, let's say, on how AI can really replace kind of that human element, and nor I don't think we want to. Like that,
mhm.
that's kind of what makes life fun and engaging and exciting. And
Exactly.
let's go ahead and use the AI tools for what they are, but let's not go ahead and delegate to them the things that we ourselves need to be engaged with.
I mean, I do see from a lot of like different friends, let's say an accountant or whatever, they say, oh, there's so many softwares now that they help you and do it much quicker and you know.
Hey, Caroline, I'm so glad you brought up accounting, right? So being in a business school, we have all these accounting majors, and I think some of them have said, "Oh my goodness, does my job go away?" And of course, no. The answer is it becomes much more interesting. I mean, if
Okay.
you think about like audit, like the idea of going in and taking a look and reconciliation of what the books say with the actual transactions, and looking at what's in inventory, like the idea that this can be done in real time with technologies like blockchain and done remotely and verified through things like a public ledger, like that frees you up to go ahead and do all the things. The measurement part of the accounting discipline, that first step, which sometimes seem the most arduous and onerous, right? That now can be automated and simplified so that you can then say, all right, well, now that we've measured it, what do we do about this? How do we go ahead and think about the way we're managing our cash flow or the way we're thinking about merging
Mm,
companies together? And so, if we get to the point of where some of these systems become more interoperable, which is again, I think related to network effects, but you
yeah.
get all these different IT systems across different companies. And at one point, integration of them became such a hindrance, but now they can be, automated much more seamlessly through some of the AI tools, through some of the network effects, the fact that a lot of them have shared vendors. Like there's some really interesting stuff going on, I think, in the health medical record space, where you have all these disparate systems and hospitals,
Mhm.
because their disparate systems couldn't work together and share patient medical information. But now, when you have companies like Epic that are there and being introduced, it becomes much easier not only exchange information, but to see increased concentration in those markets, and potentially kind of increased use of AI because you're ingesting all sorts of new data that you hadn't previously.
We are the internet is crack, so we are somewhat pessimistic, although we can't
Off
accept
and on.
we can't accept completely bullish answers.
No, trust me. I would say a level of skepticism is a good thing in this space because I think the pendulum has always swung, right? Whenever we
Right.
saw the enthusiasm that the internet's going to change everything, and with the
Yeah.
dot-com bubble, right? It clearly it came back. Now, AI is gonna, again, the pendulum is going to come back, and so like the idea that we get to be participative, we get to be skeptics, that we get to recognize that as great as ChatGPT is, right? ChatGPT isn't going to just dissolve all industries and forms of employment.
No, that's true. And I just got to say this on a funny note. A friend of mine, we had like a mass text message, and he was writing, he wrote a text, and then one of the other friends, she said like, "Did you use ChatGPT?" And then he started laughing because I could totally tell when you're texting or when people,
Yeah.
because it starts to be repetitive,
Mhm.
same kind of answers. And, it was just funny. And I laughed so
That's
hard.
great.
It's like,
They said that they did a study of that I don't know if it's the case now, but a few months ago, GPT was using the word delve at
oh, yeah.
a like a much higher rate than a normal human being would, and they started looking at research papers by academics, and they started to find the word delve at a rate that matched ChatGPT, and so it's even affecting, those in the ivory towers are still have their phones out, and so, I mean, I think there is still a little bit of internet is cracked because I find myself I vowed there are episodes, that we have, most notably, my cousin is a computer programmer. Before I had ChatGPT, I was telling him, "Oh, this is terrible, I will never use it, it's a downfall of humanity," and now I'm using it, but I actually still think it could be the downfall of humanity because I'm not always happy with how I use it, to be quite honest with you.
Well,
Yeah.
I will tell you from a professor standpoint is the students in my classes do use it, and I could tell the difference between when they're using it well and when they're not using it well. And the delve example is kind of a great one where it's like, you've never used this word before, you're using it way too often now, like I can see it. But the biggest mistake that students and this they don't think about this is you give them a prompt, right? You say, here's a question that I want you to go ahead and struggle with, right? So how does, let's say, the internet affect globalization and stuff like that? Great question, right? And stuff. The student might have writer's block and say, I don't know what to do. I'm just going to copy and paste what the professor gave me and put it into ChatGPT. The problem is if they just take verbatim what I gave them, other students in the class are doing the same thing. So they haven't done their own prompt translation. So it's not necessarily, plagiarism because they're not, but they're not even smart enough to go ahead and change the prompt to make it in their own words. So I said, look, let's do this. Like, and I taught them like, okay, take the question, turn it into your own, ask it in your own words, ask it multiple times, and then synthesize it together. Like the idea of taking disparate pieces of information and coming up with your own original thought or being able to tie the logic. Like that's what we're trying to teach people, at university. And so, yes, go ahead and use ChatGPT to get away from that writer's block or to get you started, but
Hmm.
don't give up editing, don't give up synthesis, don't give up with analysis. And if you could do those things, then you're good.
For instance, the network effect. I spent a lot of time on ChatGPT trying to learn what it meant, so I didn't cheat.
It's great. I mean, the way in which like Google structured now, when you're searching for something where it can say, look, here's a result that's kind of synthesis across a bunch of stuff that we've seen. And then you can go ahead and explore further so that you don't have to do that. Again, it's just one step closer to having that, private tutor or that kind of subject matter expert sitting next to you to help kind of uncover stuff.
Exactly.
But the idea
Yeah.
is, again, when the results come back, how do you teach people to be skeptical, to make it of your own so they don't. Again, that's the second part of the screw up is not just taking my prompt, copying and pasting, put the chat,
Hmm.
but then taking the answer and not editing it and putting it into their answer. So now I know when both of them come back and they both use delve 10 times, it's like, oh, come on. This is not good.
You busted. That actually that's a good way of thinking of too. And we just said earlier about just how to deal with it. Like both you can use it and that maybe will give us as a human a job security too. Like we can't just use
Well, I
it.
mean, can we teach AI to be curious? I don't know the answer to
I
that.
don't think so.
But
No,
I
I
think
don't know.
humans are insatiably curious, and we can
Yeah.
kind of build on that, and that will allow us to ask questions that maybe it couldn't be thought of by an AI engineer. I don't know.
Just gonna say my father's a mathematician and Terry Tao, I don't know if you know who Terry Tao is. He's the greatest living mathematician, and he,
I by reputation, yes.
yeah, by reputation.
Eh.
Well, my dad seems to think so too, but I don't know. Yes, but he,
I don't know.
who knows? He's very smart, and both he and my dad doubt whether these LLMs or artificial intelligence in general, not necessarily just an LLM, will be able to think about a question, prove the theorem, go through all those steps that a high level, any scientist, you know. But on the other hand, to be honest, I think it will. So where do you come down on
Oh,
this?
tell me more. I wanna hear more about
I
that.
feel like that uh, Jeffrey Hinton just won the Nobel Prize, and I tend to be on his team, even though a lot of people are poo pooing. His essential, if I understand him correctly, his essential assertion is that we aren't creating artificial intelligence; we are creating a stew for that intelligence to be born. And so that it is going to develop and develop, and we won't understand what it's doing or why it's doing what it's doing, but it will, right, it will eventually meet and exceed human intelligence, whatever that means. Obviously, there's tons of
Yeah.
different types of intelligence, but it will be doing creative work at a level that humans work.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, I see. I think about, people like learned mathematicians and scholars who come up with these, models, these mathematical models that, lead to all sorts of new insights and ways of thinking and sometimes are very difficult to understand and sometimes they're really fond of the fact that mathematically it's consistent within its own universe and may not have any specific application to the world we see around us. And, I think, it's that last part where I kind of take a pause a little bit saying, if these AI models are coming up with really new paradigmatic ways of thinking that we can't understand or relate to, is it really going to make an impact on society? It's when it can
Mm,
come up and actually do that translation that it's like, okay, now, now maybe there's a way of thinking about that, right? The idea that like an Einstein kind of relativity, aha type of thing, can an AI model come up with something like that and then get us to say, "Oh, we've been thinking about it all wrong."
mm.
I mean, that would be again, maybe I'm coming on the bullish side of this, but still pretty cool if it can inspire us as humans to go ahead and think differently about the world and maybe poke some holes into some of the assumptions that we've been making about something as simple as, is light, both a wave as well as, other ways of energy and like
Mm.
the fact that it can be both, like that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Do you think, like with AI, we widen the economic gap between the tech giants and the smaller companies, or will it create
Mm.
more opportunity or new opportunities for
Mhm.
competition?
Yeah, it's a question I think that I've asked and I thought I answered, and then I go back and I change my mind depending upon which industry or which context I look in. So,
Mm,
um, I think right now we're seeing kind of that bimodal distribution of firms, right? We're seeing incredible innovation and entrepreneurial and stuff like that, in part because you've got many big firms that still have an appetite to grow inorganically. So they're buying up the small firms, which then
right,
creates kind of this the question is, what happens to that middle? That middle is either, too big to be acquired by the tech giants, and
right.
potentially too slow to keep up or don't have the resources to keep up, but they're maybe too big to go ahead and again be that acquired firm. So we're kind of getting that kind of the dumbbell, the bimodal distribution of small firms and large firms. When you look at how quickly AI is moving, I still think that there's
Mhm.
a pretty, healthy, exit strategy for some of these firms to go to the tech giants, especially when it makes sense because of network effects and interoperability among systems. But I don't necessarily think that, if the tech giants become a little bit too complacent, kind of the fat and happy thing,
Mhm.
then it's just going to allow for this kind of growth of the one. Where I thought you were going, Caroline, was to ask about the income disparity that might
Mm,
exist in our society. So it's not just the idea of the size of the firm, but it's like, what do the people who work at these firms, what do they make, and what's a delta or difference between, let's say, the people who are part of the knowledge, creation AI side of the business versus, let's say, the people who are, more of the entry level positions. And that I don't know. I mean, I would say, there's certainly plenty of evidence to show that the disparity in some of these companies and our
mm.
society is growing with technology. But again, it does seem to be this thing that it's not just one direction. There seems to be the ebbs and flows that you would expect in other parts of industry and society.
Mm. Because I think a lot about it sometimes the smaller store, the mamas and papas store, like Amazon is now the big giant who I mean, I can sit at home and I can order screws instead of go down to the hardware store. Like,
Right.
are they gonna die out, or
Well, I mean, very much clearly they have died out, right? Because
yeah, they
Amazon
have.
has, basically replaced. And as you go to small towns, across the United States and you take a look at what's going on, is the small shops have had to change, right? Their
Yeah.
margins they're getting on screws or small appliances, stuff like they're just not there. So they've had to change the products that they're offering, the prices that they charge. It's become much more artisanal and craft-like. And, so product variety has actually increased a lot in these kind of geographic, micro economic environments, exist because of the Amazon effect.
Okay.
But it has also changed the way we think about, franchises and the way we think about the nuance associated with, stores. So even just like in retail space, you don't get
Yeah.
the regional differences among the retail giants. It's much more homogeneous
Uh-huh.
throughout the
Mm, mm.
country. And so the real world experience, the online experience has kind of changed, and then has seen this whole kind of movement. I think about craft beers, and
Mm.
the idea that you can still get, these incredible microbrews and craft beers that exist, even if you have, let's say the big kind of monoliths at the top end.
Yeah, that's true.
That's interesting, actually. I mean, that kind of challenges our view of monopoly maybe a little bit. And I guess the first question is it monopolistic? Second question is, what should the regulatory system, how should we get involved? Because although it seems like the internet has been here for a long time, it's been here for a very short time, especially with regard to how government works. So a regulatory system has not necessarily caught up with um, the speed of innovation.
And if you take a look at, again, the regulatory system, especially that kind of is there and inserts itself when necessary when it comes to looking at monopoly rents that exist within markets. I think the biggest argument that a lot of these kind of tech giants have been able to say is, we're not making monopoly rents on a lot of our products. We might have a pretty significant position, but ChatGPT doesn't charge you for every query that you make, even if it's costing them something. People
Mm.
still use Google and Gmail and stuff like that. They're not charging you, for the privilege of using that. So they're not making monopoly rents, and a lot of our kind of antitrust or monopolistic kind of regime and regulatory system is based upon the idea that you're making monopoly profits. You're taking consumer surplus away and transferring it to producer surplus. And here, the easiest argument is to say, we're not really getting any producer surplus. We're giving some of these products away for free. And I think the argument now has been, but because there are so many interdependencies, is you're building a market leadership position in one market that you can be exploitative in potentially an adjacent market, either crowding out competition or having kind of acquisitions that nobody else can have, ability to explore or maybe even prevent some innovations for happening. And so again, the legal system is kind of exploring this right now. All the tech
Mm.
giants have a pretty significant presence here in the Washington D.C. area. They
Yeah.
recognize that they just can't ignore policymakers, that they need to make sure they stay connected with the legislators. And they're very interested, of course, in seeing who's sitting in the White House, as we saw with the last presidential election.
Mm.
So I think from a technology, governance perspective, is the tech people recognize that they need to self-govern. And if they don't, and they're unfettered, that they will have some level of participation, let's say, by the government. And that could be much worse than their own kind of abilities to do it. And I'm reminded of the economic principle of limit pricing. Um, so limit pricing is uh, whenever somebody has a monopoly, instead of exploiting the heck out of it in the short run, where you know you're going to get slapped down later, is you actually want to throttle back a little bit of your greed. And that way you can go ahead and preserve your monopoly positions. Oh, look, but we're giving this away, or, we
Ah,
haven't gotten monopoly rents. We've kind of thrown it back. So the idea is to limit it just enough that the government will stay away. And I think that type of behavior, whatever that proper corollary is in tech space, is we know we have a market position, but we don't want to exploit it too much because we know if we do, we're exposing ourselves. So we'll go ahead and be a little bit more discerning and perhaps a little bit more humble when it comes to taking a look at market leadership positions. So Europeans want to come in and tell people in Silicon Valley what to do. Well, let's go ahead and open up some research centers in Europe. Let's go ahead and get some
mm.
participation with some of the European universities. Like, there's a good reason, strategic reason, for them to exhibit this behavior.
What do you think about gig workers? I mean, the internet has certainly brought a change in the way the workforce force is composed. I mean, for instance, our interview is a testament to this, right?
Yeah.
Probably as little as 10 years ago, maybe, would have been pretty much impossible to have this interview without us flying to DC, Maryland
Yeah,
to
yeah.
see you.
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
So, what do you see in terms of just the change in the labor force, the way it's used? And do you think how do we properly protect workers in the coming years?
Yeah, so, I mean, I think the idea of the gig worker is, again, something that's here to stay. I think it's very exciting. I think, when I teach students in Gen Z about the way in which they think about what does work mean, it's not just that, kind of 9 to 5, sole employer. Like, I think, my culture when I was growing up was like, you have a job and you're loyal to that employer. You would never, ever think about, a
Right.
side hustle where you're generating some income elsewhere. But again, I think there's just a different value proposition that a lot of the Gen Z have with their, and so the idea of saying, look, in addition to working however many hours and whatever my responsibilities are, if I'm in a space that isn't competing with my employer, that I can have a side hustle and be a gig worker. It could be something as simple as, doing DoorDash or Uber, but it could
Yeah.
be much more complicated than, let's say, writing code for a startup, or, potentially, teaching a class. That's great. Like, the barriers to entry of getting into new markets and exploring that. And then, of course, the interesting thing is what happens when the script flips? Well, now all of a sudden your side hustle becomes your main hustle, and your main
Yeah.
hustle, now the employer needs to make a decision. Do I lose this employee, or do I figure out a different way to construct the relationship that I have with them to potentially retain them? And so we can kind of whittle it down to the core essentials of what makes this person valuable to us. And now we could be ourselves be thinking about, instead of having a full-time employee, I could be hiring gig workers as well. So I think it has
Mm.
created this a little bit more fluidity. I think it's kind of created a little bit of a relationship that's maybe not quite monogamous, if you will.
Mhm.
When it comes to an employer and employee relationship. But in general, whenever there are disruptions to the market, and certainly as we've seen with the pandemic, the ability to go ahead and have side hustles that can go ebb and flow with whatever the economy is doing is a great thing. It just introduces more agility into our markets.
I think it's kinda dangerous, but on the other hand, I mean, I feel that, it's leaving that traditional setup that, yeah, you worked for. I mean, not to date myself, but, as I was growing up, yeah, I felt like I would have an employer, hopefully a university, and I would be there for my entire life. But on the other hand, I mean, this is a podcast, but it's also a business, and we're able to do this. I mean, every piece of technology I've got here, my camera, my computer, all this stuff. So it's amazing.
Yeah, I love it. I think it's wonderful. Yeah, I mean, again, it's just a testament to how technology can free us and enable us to do things that we couldn't. And that kind of notion that we have on the part, and maybe I'm the wrong person to speak to. I've been at the University of Maryland for 27 years. I'm, you know, very loyal, very happy. It's
Mm,
great. I've got great benefits. I've got a great network of people and stuff like that. But it's not for everybody. And so that kind of contract that I have with them or they have with me and stuff like that is different than, let's say, they have with somebody who's more on the gig worker side of it, who says, "Let me come to the University of Maryland. I'll teach some classes. I'll maybe do some research. I'll get some publications out, but then I'm back in the market. I'm going someplace else." That loyalty may not be there for them. And employers, again, have to figure out, how do we balance our portfolio of professors, of students, or whatever it is, to make sure that we can serve both. Again, bring it back to higher education. We have some of our students, right, that are here, undergraduates for 4 years and stuff, but then we have executives that might only be here for a class. It's a very different
mm,
type of relationship that we have with them. And, Seth, what you do is really cool, enabled by all this stuff. But, you take a look at all the guests that you've had on the show, right? Only possible because you have this format, this
right.
technology.
Only possible. Yep.
And I do think too, like when I see the younger generation, that they also are more, I don't want to say resilience, if that's the right word, but they are not. They're like, oh, okay, I will work here, but you can hold me down. I can go somewhere else. That bringing back power in a way. I think my generation didn't do as much because of what we were saying. Like, you stayed in a job longer, or most people did, and I always hear people say, "Oh, those millennials, they don't like to work, or they don't do this. They always quit or whatever." But maybe that's a part of this new generation that they I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's
No,
bad,
I think that's an
I think
excellent
it's
point.
yeah,
I mean, in a way, I mean, what you're saying is, yeah, the free market. They're
free
taking
market.
advantage of the free market, basically, in a way that people of our age may not have
Yeah, they're not
been
so
comfortable with.
scared. They're not so scared. They can pack the bag
Yeah.
and be like, "Okay,
Mhm.
I'm leaving,"
Yep. Yep.
you know?
And I'm seeing also with Gen Z is, they're perfectly fine saying, "I'm going to quit my job," and like the idea to not have another job that you're going to, that you could take 6 months off and travel, or and when they go back into the workforce, yeah, I mean, and maybe there's a little bit of an assumption about kind of where our unemployment numbers are, that unemployment number is going to stay as low as it is. But our society is certainly some potential changes on that right now.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting point. It
Well, I
could
think
be.
being in the DMV area, where DC, Maryland, Virginia, and stuff like that, there's a lot of federal employees who might be looking for new places to work.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah. Those numbers might not look as good in a few
yeah.
months.
And
Yeah, we'll see what
now
happens to the housing market. So I know we're getting farther away from internet
Yeah,
economics,
yeah,
but
yeah, we're getting
the
yeah, I
truth
know, we
is,
are.
no,
Yeah,
it's
that's
okay. Like, internet economics is basically economics these days, because the internet has been so pervasive.
that is such a
yeah.
good point, and we cut up our, interviews to do advertising, like, into little bits, and I guarantee you what you just said will make it into a bit. The
Yeah, yeah. But then I wanna ask her, so is the personal data, just to go back, is the personal data the new oil? Is it, or does it oversimplify then all of
Uh,
it? Like,
yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. So we take a look about, scarce resources and stuff. And I think we can look at oil and as a natural resources, scarce resource and stuff like that. Personal
mhm,
data, I mean, the amount of data that we generate individually. And but I just think about my own personal data. I'm not very interesting. And if somebody really wanted to buy it, like, have at it. There's not much to glean from it. But the idea that the personal data, some of it is more valuable than others, and trying to figure out which of it's valuable to whom, and creating markets for it. Now that's, I think, an interesting story, especially when you can imagine you've got two different companies with two very different lenses
mhm.
into a customer or into an employee. And if we can put them together, now all of a sudden we have a much better opportunity to to shape or influence what they purchase, where they're employed, what products or services that we're going to market to them. So I don't know if it's the new oil, but certainly it is a new kind of part of currency. And to
Mm,
bring it back to kind of cryptocurrency is, imagine now, if we're thinking about blockchain transactions and they're not anonymized, but rather that we are associated with an individual. So if you're doing supply chain management for a company, is it's not just, hey, I'm buying these, herbs and spices from a particular grower, but that's a public transaction. We know who the buyers, we know who the seller are. Now that is kind of there in the record for all time. And so personal information might actually be the new level of currency, and the price of that currency might be very low because it's available to all.
well, that's interesting. But isn't also with like blockchain that you can make up your identity? Not make it up, but I mean, I can call myself something else, right? Like if you go from one side, is because
Yeah, I mean,
I've
so there's a question, right? When you are kind of deemed an entity that's there in the blockchain on the ledger and stuff like that, how can that be traced back to you, or how as much is
right.
it an autonomous separate entity? Yeah, so that question about, anonymizing entities within blockchain, or how much needs to be authenticated and stuff like that. Believe it or not, the people who operate the kind of the ledgers, and the key servers, right? They're going to have a big, I think, role in figuring out how to preserve or protect someone's privacy versus potentially revealing it. And it's one reason
Mm,
why, maybe some of these servers that are located outside different jurisdictions, might be more insulated from some of the regulatory approval, or some of the intervention that might happen in legislation.
Yeah, I've
mm,
heard about that. I don't know if this is true, but that there are barges in international waters with supercomputers, so they can be, completely unregulated and do whatever they want to do.
I've trolled a little bit on Google Earth to find these barges, but I haven't seen them yet. So maybe
okay.
maybe they're there and they're just evading the satellites.
And, as somebody who's studied economics, it sounds like you've been studying economics pre-internet, post-internet, and now into AI.
Yeah.
What do you feel like has been the biggest change as as a professor, as a
Mm.
researcher? What do you feel like has changed most dramatically?
Uh, I mean, for me, and maybe this is just my arc kind of as an academic, but the things that become possible, right? So the possibility of getting new sources of data to do research, the ability to teach new audiences of students, the ability to participate in conferences that would otherwise inaccessible, right? It's the opportunities are so much more plentiful, including the opportunities for businesses to explore new markets, provide new products, to reach, again, new business partnerships and stuff like that. Was kind of unthought of, or difficult, and now it's become much more accessible. So we've had to change our way of thinking, which is not what is possible, but really what are the priorities? What are the things that we need to pay attention to, and how do we say no? And I
Mm,
think saying no is probably more important than saying yes, because of the opportunity cost of our time. So to bring it back to economics,
mm,
I teach. In fact, I was teaching yesterday a class, talking about kind of financial peer mentoring, and I was teaching about opportunity cost, and we were talking about the cost of higher education, and issues associated with opportunity cost, taking one internship versus another, taking a job while you're still a full time
mm,
student. The idea of an opportunity cost has actually, I think, gone up, not just because the opportunities are there,
mhm.
but the idea that the cost of our time and attention. So, um, I think, for me, the biggest change is again not is because of the possibilities we have. We've actually had to change the way which we think about those possibilities, and decide to focus, on the things that we're good at, and maybe the things that we say no to.
Well, I'm glad you chose the opportunity cost of your time with us.
Oh, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you.
Well, I do see like I don't know how many what do you call it, SpaceX who's flying up. I saw today again. One of my friends posted it like another one. I mean, we gotta admire it. That's a lot of stuff going up there. I don't know if that's good either though, but
Well, that actually brings up an interesting question, if I may, which is Starlink and the interaction now with technology. Where does government end and these tech
Mm,
companies have so much power?
yeah, that's a
I
good
mean,
question.
Yeah. I
this
mean,
is
it's like the barges of data centers that are floating in international waters. Can you actually think about low Earth orbiting satellites that are not necessarily, adhering to some of the policies that we set up with regard to governance of the airspace above our country? And so, when
Yeah,
Musk, was basically saying he's not going to turn off Starlink as it's passing through, portions of the Middle East and stuff like that, and it's over the Ukraine and stuff. It does kind of call into question, is kind of small government, is there idea that, tech has its own kind of governance structure? So
mm,
before I was, saying that, you have this limit pricing approach to kind of throttling back or pulling back on some of your ambitions as a company to go ahead and skirt or stay away from scrutiny of government. Maybe it's a point where there's some governments that they don't want to adhere or pull back from, that they're willing to take them on and engage with them, and potentially fight that in more of the court of public opinion. And so I do think, yes, when it comes to space, when it comes to international barges with data centers, we do need to look at the question of, are technology companies, sufficiently mobile enough that they can go ahead and pick and choose which
yeah.
governments they want to partner with and potentially live outside of that space.
Yeah, I actually think it's kind of scary, like there's how big are they and what kind of regulations can we do? Because they're super powerful.
exactly. I mean, on the
Yeah.
one hand, my uncle, he's since passed away, unfortunately, was a physicist and worked at NASA, and I think he would be so unhappy to see the way things have ma- turned out. But on the other hand, as an economist, as there, you might let me ask you this: do you think, kind of in the bottom of your heart, you're saying, "Well, look at this. This is competition builds the best competitor, and
Mm.
government doesn't participate in that competition, and it's not surprising that the person sending rockets to the International Space Station is a private company."
I must admit that I used to be of the mindset that, what the commercial, space companies are doing was a huge negative, and I've really, I think, kind of gone the other way,
Mhm,
which is, I think it's a huge positive that there is competition among them, that
mhm,
organizations like NASA now free to focus on other parts and rely on commercial space to go ahead and basically buy from the market that which they otherwise would make. Um, the role of government is interesting, right? And I think kind of
mm,
being inside the University of Maryland is right inside the DC Beltway, kind of in the Northeast. And so, we're very much, impacted and connected with the federal government. And we recognize that there's roles that the federal government plays in all technology markets. So it's not just, the fact that they may or may not regulate it, is the fact that they're a big buyer of technology. They're the ones who, created the first backbone of the internet, and then,
mm,
kind of gave it away. So the idea that they're funding research development, especially when it comes to these pre-competitive stage of technology. So if NASA is out there and saying, look, you know, rocket technology and space exploration is possible, and now we're making it available to commercial, and they're showing restraint and saying, let's make this ecosystem of companies and flourish. Like, that's a really positive thing. So I think the commercial one, I think I was, of the mindset, like, only NASA can really embody the
mhm.
true mission of what it is to do space and to build the best technology and not have to worry about the competitive pressures. And now I kind of see that maybe this is a huge blessing for NASA. They can focus on other parts of their mission and not have to worry about the rocketry and other elements of space.
Maybe a last question before we let you go is, how does the government interject itself, and when is it when is it
Mm.
good to interject, and when is it good to step back? What are your feelings as a business professor? Where do you think the philosophy should be regarding all this new technology that's coming?
Yeah.
forward?
So, my first reaction is I think the role of government in markets is totally misunderstood. I think that there is a view of some that say government should just stay out of our way and not participate. And I think some of them don't appreciate then how the government has actually been able to make markets, to grow technology, to help
Mm-hmm.
participate in markets. The role of government to be a huge buyer. We were talking about Elon Musk and all of his companies that are receiving contracts from the federal government. So the government, I think, isn't monolithic. It has to be understood with all the different ways in which they participate. And certainly, what I try to teach students, and when we talk about it in class, I do an MBA class on managing R&D, and we talk about the role the government has in everything from Operation Warp Speed and bringing the
Mm.
vaccines to the market during the pandemic, the way in which the internet evolved and was created, the way in which kind of space was not only explored and the technology was created, but potentially how it was let go by the federal government. So, like, it's much more nuanced and understood from the role of government being kind of this enabler, oftentimes, of things to exist. And if companies are on the sideline, not willing to take the risk, sometimes the government is in a much better position to take the risk and put something out there, even something as simple. And I give the example in class about kind of the fleets of United States postal worker trucks, right? All the trucks that you see, with the Eagle logo, red, white, and blue trucks and stuff. The idea is like somebody needed to move first in a big way to think about, other vehicles that were not powered by, gasoline. And, the Postal
Mhm.
Service was out there and maybe it was a failed experiment, but, isn't it great that the government was willing to go ahead and put in those, natural gas vehicles and now electric vehicles to go
Mhm.
ahead and help spur the market a little bit and sometimes accept a price point that's above what the market is, but somebody's got to be an early mover sometimes to help drive that price point down. And the government can,
That's
have
true.
that leverage in markets. So, I'm always in admiration of our federal workers, public servants who do such an amazing job. And I think they show incredible restraint when it comes to kind of letting businesses pick up what oftentimes they create.
Because the internet was built off of
Yeah.
government. The government gave it away,
I
and
know it
it
was
would not
amazing.
exist. Zuckerberg would not exist without the
Yeah.
government, and
It
that's
it
painful for him to think about, I'm sure.
I'm sure.
it Probably, yes.
All
Yeah.
right. Well, I really, really appreciate you talking.
Of course.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for
Thank
having me,
you.
Caroline, Seth. Thank you both.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for watching or listening to The Internet is Crack. Tune in next week when we have another great conversation about robotics, AI, and the internet. You can watch us or listen to us on YouTube or Spotify or many other outlets. And don't forget to follow us on social media. See you next Monday.